You're in violation, and I'm calling 911. Dorothy, the HOA's despotic queen, screamed in my Lakeside cabin's driveway, furious my car was 3 and off. Her rules had just returned, craving peace after a brutal year, but her fines threatened to crush me but 6. Minutes after her call to the cops, I found a secret that demolished her 25-year. Legala Merciless flawlessly her 911 tantrum. Ended her HOA empire comment your should have faced an HOA. Karen Dorothy thought she'd ruin me, but those 6 minutes sealed her downfall the moment I pulled into the driveway of my grandparents' Lakeside cabin. I felt my shoulders drop for the first time in 3 months. After the nightmare of whistleblowing on my former boss for embezzlement and losing my job in retaliation, this place was supposed to be my sanctuary. The familiar scent of pine mixed with lake water hit me as I stepped out of my beat-up Honda Civic carrying a cardboard box with the few personal items I'd salvaged from my office. I carefully placed my grandparents' photo on the mantle, them standing right here 40 years ago. Smiling like they'd found paradise finally, I whispered to myself some peace and quiet. Irony of that statement would hit me exactly 5 minutes later when the aggressive knocking started. Not a friendly neighbor tap, but the kind of pounding that makes you check if maybe the SWAT team got the wrong address. I opened the door to find a woman in her mid-50s, wearing a perfectly pressed lavender blazer. Despite the summer heat, had a measuring tape already extended in one hand and a leather-bound notebook in the other. Dorothy Mitchell, HOA president, she announced with the gravity of someone declaring war. I make the rules here. I'm already in violation before I could even form a response. She pushed past me and marched straight to my car, extending her measuring tape from the vehicle to the curb. 2 feet, she muttered, scribbling. Furiously, regulation is 3.0 feet. That's a $50 fine. She spun around, her eye scanning my appearance with obvious disgust. Those work clothes are inappropriate for Lakeside standards. This vehicle is an eyesore that brings down property values, and this grass she bent down, actually measuring individual blades. 2 in regulation height is 3.0 and another $50 fine. The woman thrust a 200-page rule book into my hands with the force of someone serving a court. Summons people like you, she said, her voice dripping with disdain. Don't fit in Lakeside, but don't worry. I'll help you adapt. The way she said adapt made it sound less like assistance and more like a threat from a movie villain behind her. A man I'd later learned was Richard Preston was already recording everything on his phone, holding it steady like a documentary filmmaker capturing a crime scene. A woman about my age walked by on the sidewalk, caught my eye for a brief moment, and gave me a look of pure sympathy. Before hurrying away, Dorothy noticed the exchange and made another note in her book. That's Linda Morrisonge said, though I hadn't asked. She learned her lesson about compliance. Last year, $500 for the wrong flowers. You dowel to learn faster than she did. I've been running this community for 15 years. Puffing with pride ever since Bob, her face suddenly twisted like she'd bitten into something rotten, and she stopped mid-sentence, her composure cracking for just a moment. She quickly recovered, but I'd seen it, a flash of something raw and painful. Behind the authoritarian mask, well, that's not important. What's important is maintaining standards. This is my community. She practically shouted the last part as if volume would make it more true, and you will comply with that. She spun on her heel and marched away, Richard Preston following like an obedient puppy. I stood in my doorway, clutching a rule book thicker than Maston ovals, wondering what parallel universe I'd stumbled into. As their footsteps faded, I noticed a sticky note on Thurl book cover in Dorothy's handwriting read carefully, "I'll be watching." The massage was clear. I was under surveillance from day one. Looking back at my grandparents' photo, I couldn't help but laugh bitterly. I'd thought I'd escaped power-tripping authority figures when I left my corporate job. Turns out I'd just traded my corrupt boss for Voldemort's suburban sister. But something bothered me beyond the fine sand threats. It was that moment when Dorothy mentioned Bob, the way her face had crumpled before she caught herself. There was a story there, something painful that she'd quickly buried under her HOA president persona, and her declaration of ownership over the community didn't sound like pride. It sounded like desperation, like someone clinging to the last life raft in a storm. Who was this woman who hated me so much when we'd never ever met? What had happened to make her this way? Comment. Karen, if you've also had that pleasure of meeting a neighbor like Dorothy. The next morning I woke up, determined to avoid another confrontation. If Dorothy wanted compliance, I'd give her compliance, at least enough to buy myself some peace. While I figured out my next move, I dragged myself out of bed at 6 o'clock a.m., threw on my oldest work clothes, partly out of necessity and partly out of spite, and hauled my grandfather's ancient push mower out of the shed. The grass honestly didn't look that bad to me, but apparently in Dorothy's world, 3.2 and might as well have been a jungle. I'd barely finished one strip across the front lawn when I heard the clicking off wheels on pavement. Stop right there. Dorothy's voice cut through the morning quiet like a rusty chainsaw. You're destroying protected indigenous vegetation. I looked down at the handful of dandelions I just pulled, then back upon her, wondering if this was some elaborate prank. These are weeds, I said slowly, holding them up as evidence. Dorothy's face flushed purple, an impressive feat that made me briefly wonder about her blood pressure. Those are native flora protected under HOA statute 17. That's destruction of community botanical assets. She whipped out a pre-printed violation notice from her blazer pocket, already partially filled out behind her. Richard Preston had materialized like a bad penny, filming everything with his phone held high. $200, Dorothy announced, scribbling the amount with a flourish. And if you continue this ecological vandalism, I'll make it $500. She handed me the citation with the satisfaction of someone who just won a major battle. But that wasn't even the worst part of my morning. 2 hours later, I walked to the community mailbox cluster to check for forwarded mail, and stopped dead in my tracks. There on the community bulletin board was my face blown up to poster size. Violator of the month, screamed the red letters above my photo. 1. Richard must have talking yesterday when I wasn't looking. Below were my alleged crimes. Grass height violation 3. 2. An unauthorized vehicle placement 3.2 feet from curb. Destruction of protected vegetation multiple counts. A woman walking her dog paused to look, shook her head, and hurried away. Kid, maybe 7 or 8, pointed at the poster and announced loudly to his mother, "Look, Mom, it's the bad man." His mother grabbed his hand and pulled him along, carefully avoiding eye contact with me. The message was crystal clear. I wasn't just being Fendi, was being publicly shamed, branded as an outsider, a troublemaker, and to be avoided. The humiliation burned in my chest as I walked back toward my house, mixing with exhaustion from months of fighting my previous battle against corporate corruption. I'd barely made it to my driveway when Linda Morrison appeared at my side. She did the same thing to me last year, Linda whispered, glancing around nervously like Dorothy might be listening from the bushes. $500 because I planted marigolds instead of petunias. I'm a nurse. I work 12-hour shifts. I don't have time to memorize which flowers are approved. But fighting her, she shook her head. That takes even more time and energy than just paying up. Before I could respond, an elderly voice called out from across the street, "Young man, Marcus, isn't it? I'm Harold Wilsank, knew your grandparents for 40 years. Why don't you come in for some tea?" There was something in his tone that suggested this was more than just a social invitation. Harold's living room was like stepping into a time capsule of Lakeside history. Photos covered every wall. The lake before any houses, the first cabins bin built community gatherings from decades past. He poured Earl Grey with steady hands while I studied a photo of me grandparents at what looked like a neighborhood barbecue. "Your grandmother would be heartbroken seeing what Dorothy's done to you," Harold said, settling into his recliner. "She and your grandfather moved here for the freedom, the peace that was before the HOA, of course." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Did Dorothy mention Bob when she was lecturing you?" When I nodded, describing her strange reaction, Harold sighed deeply. "I figured as much. Bob Mitchell was the original Hope resident back in 2000. Charming fellow, could sell ice to Eskimos, convinced most of us that forming an HOA would protect our property values and keep out the wrong element." Harold's face darkened. Ash continued. "Dorothy was his biggest supporter, his enforcer, you might say. She'd follow him around with a clipboard, taking notes on everything he said. They seemed like the perfect power couple." In 2010, the whole thing exploded. Bob had been having an affair with the HOA secretary, young woman named Jennifer. One day, they just vanished, cleaned out the HOA bank account, and disappeared leaving Dorothy with their teenage daughter and the humiliation of everyone knowing she'd been played for a fool. The old man shook his head sadly. Dorothy took over the oath next. Day no election, no discussion. She just announced she was president.
Owie.
Think everyone was too shocked to argue, and frankly we felt sorry for her bet that sympathy was a mistake. She turned the HOA into her personal kingdom. One thing she could. Control when everything else in her life had fallen apart, but here's what's always bothered. Harold leaned forward, lowering his voice back. When Bob was forming the HOA, I never signed those papers, neither did Tom Henderson, Bill Martinez, or several others. We didn't want to give up our property rights, but somehow Bob claimed he'd had enough signatures anyway. 75% is required by state law, and here's their alley. Strange part, I remember him mentioning names of folks who'd already passed on. Tom Henderson died in 1998, but Bob swore Tom had signed Bill. Martinez passed in 97, but his name was supposedly in those papers too. Harold's revelation hung in the air between us like a loaded gun on the table. If you're thinking of fighting Dorothy, he said finally, you might want to start by checking those original signatures. I walked back to my cabin with my mind spinning at my car. I stood for a long moment with my keys in hand. Every instinct screamed at me to pack up and leave. I just spent 3 months fighting corporate corruption, testifying against my former boss, dealing with lawyers and threats. Did I really want to start another war? But then I looked through the window at my grandparents' photo and heard my grandfather's voice in my memory. Never let anyone run you off your own land, Marcus. Stand your ground. I put the keys back in my pocket and made a decision. If Dorothy wanted to use the law as a weapon against me, maybe it was time. He'll learn to use it as a shield, but more than that, if Harold's suspicions were right, Dorothy's entire kingdom might be built on a foundation of lies. The question was, how deep did the Deception go? Drop a comment. What do you think? Dorothy's really hiding. The county records office had that universal government building smell, a mixture of old paper, industrial carpet, and broken dreams. I'd arrived right when they opened at 8 o'clock a.m., armed with nothing but determination and a vague idea, that's a mething about the HOA formation. Didn't add up. Harold's words from yesterday kept echoing in my mind. Signatures from dead people, neighbors who never agreed to join, if even half of what he suspected was true. I might have found crack in Dorothy's armor as I pushed through the heavy glass doors. I nearly collided with someone coming out. Marcus, it was Linda Morrison, clutching a folder to her chest. Don't tell me Dorothy drove AO. Here too, she held up her folder with a grim smile. Property records. I want to understand exactly what I supposedly agreed to when I bought my house. That $500 she took from me last year, that's me daughter's college fund money. We ended up at adjacent research tables in the basement archives, united in our confusion and determination to understand the legal maze we'd found ourselves in. The clerk who approached us was a middle-aged Latino man with kind eyes and the weary expression of someone who'd seen too many HOA casualties. Let me guess, he said before we could speak. Lakeside HOA troubles? When we both nodded, he actually laughed, though there was no humor in it. You're the 12th and 13th people this year. I'm Stan Rodriguez, and before you ask why I care, my wife got hit with a $1,000 fine 3 years ago. Our crime painting our shutters seafoam blue instead of ocean blue. Dorothy said it was a critical violation of the color harmony standards. His face hardened at memory. That $1,000 was supposed to go toward our son's braces, so yeah, I pay attention to HOA law now. Can't give legal advice officially, but I can show you where all the public records are kept and maybe point out some interesting documents along the way forth. Next, for hours, I dove into a world of property deeds, covenant agreements, and county records. My software engineer brain kicked into high gears. I created a spreadsheet on my laptop, cross-referencing everything I found. Stan proved invaluable, appearing periodically to point out relevant filing cabinets or explain arcane legal terms. Linda worked beside me, occasionally gasping at what she discovered in her own documents. Look at this, she whispered at one point. The HOA claims authority over all aspects of property, appearance, and use. That's insane. But my biggest discovery came when I found my grandparents' original property documents. The deed was from 1952, when the area was barely developed, and there in fading typewriter ink was a clause. That made my heart race. This property shall remain free and independent of any future neighborhood association and ish homeowners groups or similar collective governance structures unless the owner provides explicit written consent to join such organizations. I read it 3 times to make sure I understood, then called Stan. Over, is this saying what I think it's saying? Stan studied the document, high size, widening with each line. Holy yes, this is a pre-existing property covenant with what we call a non-incorporation clause. In layman's terms, he looked up a team with something. Like Glee, your property is HOA proof. It's like diplomatic immunity, unless you or your grandparents specifically sign papers agreeing to join the HOA. Dorothy has no more authority over your property than she does over the moon. My hands were shaking. As I flipped through more papers, but I inherited this property. Wouldn't the HOA membership transfer? Stan shook his head, pulling up statutes on his computer. Not with these 1950s covenants. They're ironclad. The county respects them. Absolutely. Look. Here's similar case from 2012. Judge ruled that these old covenants supersede any later HOA formation unless explicitly waived in writing by the property owner. Linda had abandoned her own research to listen. Wait, so Dorothy can't actually find Himmel? Those violations she wrote up. Stan's grin widened. Not only can't she find him, she has no authority over his property whatsoever. She could stand on his lawn screaming about grass height all day long, and legally it would just be trespassing. He made several copies of the key documents, handing them to me with barely concealed satisfaction. Official copies, 50 cents each, though. If Dorothy asks, the machine was broken, and I had to make extras for our files. Their revelation should have made me ecstatic. But instead, I felt oddly deflated. This protects me, I said slowly. But what about everyone else? What about Linda and all others who've been suffering under Dorothy's regime for years? Stan's expression sobered. That's the thing about shields, though. They only protect the person holding them, unless he paused, seeming to debate something internally, unless the sword they're defending against isn't real in the first place. Osway gathered our documents to leave. Linda grabbed my arm. Don't you see what this means? If Dorothy's been lying about having authority over your property, what else has she been lying about? Maybe we should dig deeper into those formation. A child mentioned. I drove home with the immunity documents on my passenger seat, feeling like I was carrying nitroglycerin when I pulled into my driveway at exactly 2 feet from the curb. Out of spite, I saw Dorothy across the street with her measuring tape out, hassling another neighbor about their hedge height. She looked up as I parked, and I couldn't help myself. I smiled broadly and waved cheerfully. Her eyes narrowed with suspicion, sensing that something had changed, but not understanding what. That night I spread documents across my kitchen table, my immunity papers surrounded by HOA rule books and county statutes. I was free from Dorothy's tyranny, but that freedom felt hollow. The real question nagging at me was simple. If I had been immune all along, why had Dorothy been so confident she could force me out? And if she was wrong about my property, what else was wrong about? Drop your theory in the comments. What do you think Dorothy's trying to hide? I woke up that morning with a plan. If Dorothy wanted to play games, I'd show her what happened when you played against someone who understood the rules better than you did. I deliberately set my lawn sprinkler torn at 8:15 a.m. A full 15 minutes past the approved watering window that ended at 8 then. I grabbed a ruler and measured me grass 4 1/2 inch over the sacred 3 in regulation. It was petty, I'll admit, but I wanted to see how Dorothy would react when confronted with someone who knew she had no actual power over them. I didn't have to wait long. At 8:30 sharp, like she'd been watching with binoculars, Dorothy came storming across the street with Richard Preston trailing behind his phone, already recording. "This is it," she shrieked, waving a fistful of pre-printed violation notices. $500 for illegal watering another, $500 for excessive grass height, $1,000 in total fines, and if you don't pay within 48 hours, I'll place a lien on your property. I stayed calm, settling deeper into my porch chair with my coffee. Actually, Dorothy, you should read section 3 subsection 7 of your own rulebook. Thepard about pre-existing property rights and covenant exemptions. The effect was immediate, and dramatic. Her face went through A series of expressions like a malfunctioning slideshow, confusion, suspicion. Then dawning horror as she realized I'd done my homework. "I don't know what game you think you're playing," she stammered, taking a step back, "but I've been running this HOA. For 15 years, I know the law better than some transient." The word was spat out like profanity. "Do you?" I asked mildly, taking another sip of coffee. "Because according to Second Eye Records Office, my property has never been part of your HOA. My grandparents never signed your formation documents, never agreed to your rules, never consented to your authority, which means every fine. You've written me as legally worthless. You might as well be writing tickets and monopoly money." Richard stopped recording the phone, dropping to his side as uncertainty crossed his face. He took a subtle step away from Dorothy, already beginning his retreat from what he sensed was a losing battle. Dorothy's face had gone from red to white to an alarming purple. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone, and could see her mind racing, trying to find a way to regain control. Then her eyes lit up with malicious inspiration. "You're rethereotaining me," she announced loudly, as if performing. "For an audience that wasn't there, I feel unsafe. This man is aggressive and dangerous." She held up her phone dramatically. "I'm calling the police." I glanced at my watch to 35 p. Imperfect. Stayed seated, keeping my hands visible and my expression calm. "This was actually better than I'd hoped." "Please do," said. "I'm sure they'll be very interested in your false allegations." Dorothy dialed 911 with theatrical flair. "There's a suspicious man at 547 Lakeside Drive threatening me. He's aggressive, Andy. Fear for my safety. Please send help immediately." Her performance was Oscar-worthy. Voice trembling free, hand clutched to her chest, even managing to squeeze out a few tears. If I hadn't been the subject of her lies, I might have been impressed by the show behind her. Richard had started recording again, probably thinking this would be Dorothy's triumph. To police cruisers arrived at 2:37 p.m. 1000, apparently a hysterical woman calling about threats, warranted a serious response. Officer Bradley, a tired, dull-looking veteran cop, would, clearly seen to many suburban dramatics, took one look at the scene and sighed deeply. Dorothy immediately launched into victim mode, pointing at me with a shaking finger. "He threatened me," he said. "I have no authority. He's trying to undermine the safety and security of our entire community." The next few minutes were crucial, and I played them carefully while Officer Bradley checked my ID and confirmed I was the legal property owner. I calmly explained the situation, showing him my county documents. His partner interviewed Dorothy, who grew increasingly shrill as she realized her story wasn't landing the way she'd hoped. At exactly 2:41 p.m., Officer Bradley turned to Dorothy with barely concealed irritation. "Ma'am, filing a false police report is a criminal offense. The homeowner showed me legal documents proving he's exempt from HOA jurisdiction. He never threatened you, stated illegal. In fact, this is your first and only warning. If you call 911 again without a real emergency, you'll be arrested." "Are we clear?" Dorothy stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Richard had not only stopped recording, but had backed away entirely, clearly wanting to distance himself from this disaster. As the police cars pulled away, I knew I had exactly the window I needed. Dorothy stood on my lawn, still in shock from her backfired plan. I pulled out my phone and begging what would become the most important 6 minutes of Lakeside's history at 2:41:30. I called Stan at the county records office. "Stan, it's Marcus. I need you to pull of everything you can find about HOA president elections since 2010, specifically any record of Dorothy Mitchell being elected to replace Bob Mitchell." His voice was eager. "I've been waiting for someone to ask. I'll start digging immediately." At 2:42:15, I called the lawyer whose card Officer Bradley had discreetly handed me. "Mr. Davis, I need to verify the legal status of an HOA president who may have assumed power without an election. Can you research this urgently?" At 2:43 exactly, I opened my laptop and composed an email to every Lakeside resident I could find. Addresses for subject: urgent legal questions about our HOA leadership emergency community meeting tomorrow night, 7:00 p.m. Community Center. Critical information about your rights and fines. At 2:44:30, I texted Linda Morrison, "Your $500 fine might be completely illegal. Can you gather Allier receipts and any documentation we need evidence? Her response was, immediate yes. I have everything at 2:46. I called. Harold, remember what you said about those signatures. I need you to think hard. Who exactly refused to sign the HOA formation? I need names, and I need you to spread the word about tomorrow's meeting. At 247 exactly, I posted in the neighborhood's private social media group. Does anyone have copies of HOA? Meeting minutes from 2010 when Bob Mitchell left, or any documentation about how Dorothy became president? This is urgent, the post. Immediately started getting reactions and comments 6 minutes. That's all it took to light the fuses that would bring down Dorothy's 25-year empire. She still stood on my lawn, looking lost and confused, unable to comprehend how her power play had backfired so spectacularly. You should go home. You told her not unkindly, despite everything you're going to want to prepare for tomorrow night. She looked at me with a mixture of fear and bewilderment. Prepare for what, she asked, her voice small and uncertain for the first time since I'd met her. I thought about all the residents she'd terrorized, all the money shed, extracted through fear and intimidation, all the lives she'd made miserable with her arbitrary rules and punishments. The truth, Dorothy, after 15 years of lies, the truth is finally coming out, and I don't think you're going to like what happens when your neighbors learn what you've really been doing. How could 6 minutes destroy a 15-year empire? Drop your guess in the comments. I bet you won't see the full truth coming. My phone rang at exactly 6 a.m., jarring me from restless dreams about measuring tapes and false police reports. Marcus, you need to get down here. Immediately, Stan's voice was breathless with excitement. I've been here since 4 a.m. going through archived boxes in our basement storage. What I found, Dorothy Mitchell isn't just a bad president. She's not a legitimate president at all. Within 30 minutes, I was back at the county records office where Stan had commandeered a conference room. Table was covered with bankers' boxes, their contents spread out like evidence in a criminal investigation. Davis, the lawyer, arrived shortly after, looking intrigued by the urgency of Stan's call. Gentlemen, Stan announced with the gravity of someone revealing state secrets, I present to you the complete Lakeside HOA records from 2010, the year Bob Mitchell disappeared. We gathered around the table as Stan opened a specific folder marked Leadership Transient. 2010, the folder was disturbingly thin. This is what I found, said, gesturing at the sparse contents, or rather, what I didn't find there. No election records, no ballots, no nominations, no minutes indicating any kind of leadership transition according to the HOA's own bylaws, which I have. Harith produced another document. When a president vacates their position, an election must be held. Within 30 days, special meeting, proper notice, nomination, secret ballot voting through the whole democratic process. Davis was already pulling up legal statutes on his laptop, his expression growing more concerned by the minute. So you're telling me Dorothy Mitchell just declared herself president and every Oniax did it? Stan nodded grimly. From what I can piece together, Bob vanished in June 2010 with the secretary and a good chunk of the HOA funds. Dorothy showed up at the July meeting, announced she was taking over, and nobody challenged her. Maybe they felt sorry for her. Maybe they were in shock, but there was never a vote. The implications hit like a sledgehammer. If she was never legally elected, I said, slowly working through the logic, then she had no authority to impose fines, change rules, or make any decisions on behalf of the HOA. Davis looked up from his laptop. Pores. Then that every fine collected under false authority could be considered fraud. Every homeowner paid illegal fines could sue for damages. We're talking about potential criminal charges and civil liability into hundreds of thousands. We were so absorbed in the revelations that none of us noticed Richard Preston enter their court's office until he appeared in our doorway. His usual smugness had been replaced by naked fear. Is it true? He asked without preamble about Dorothy not being elected. When we confirmed what? We'd found Richard collapsed into a chair like his legs had given out. Eelways thought she was properly elected. I've been on the board for 10 years, enforcing rules, supporting her decisions out. God, have I been party to fraud this whole time? Davis nodded gravely. Every board member who enforced illegal fines or rules could potentially face civil suits. Did she know she wasn't elected? Richard shook his head vigorously. She told us she was the rightful successor. She said Bob had designated her. Before I left, we never saw paperwork because she said the records were stolen along with the money. I believed her. We all believed her. His face had gone pale. I have 3 kids in college. I can't afford lawsuits. What do I do? Davis studied him for. A moment. Help us document everything. Board meetings, decisions, fines. We need a paper trail. Cooperation could significantly help your position. Richard nodded. Eagerly, I have recordings of board meetings on my phone. Dorothy always ran them like a dictator. No dissent. Allowed. No questions permitted. I thought it was just her management style, but now by that time. I returned home. My email inbox had exploded. Over 30 responses. From recitants, each with their own horror story of Dorothy's reign. Linda Morrison had created a spreadsheet that would make any engineer proud. 5 years of fines, meticulously documented with dates, amounts, and alleged violations. Her family alone had paid over $3,000, her email emphasized, for crimes like wrong flowers, grass height, and onsbecos. My daughter's bicycle was visible from the street for more than 2 hours. Another resident. Janet Palmer shared an even more disturbing story. In 2012, I asked at a meeting why we never had elections for president. Dorothy fined me $300 for disrupting community harmony and undermining HOA authority. When I protested that asking questions was sent a finable offense, she threatened to make it. Then a borehood and couldn't afford to fight, so I paid and never spoke up again. The pattern was crystal clear. Dorothy had maintained power through fear, intimidation, and financial punishment of anyone who dared question her authority. But cracks were forming rapidly in her kingdom. Richard sent me a private message with a treasure trove of board meeting recordings attached. Listen to these. His message read, "Every meeting starts with Dorothy saying, 'I've decided' or 'I've determined.' Never the board votes or well discussed. I'm ashamed I never saw it before that evening." I compiled everything into a comprehensive presentation. My fingers flew over the keyboard with the same intensity I'd used to expose corporate fraud at my old job. Slide after slide of evidences, missing election records, the violated bylaws, the illegal fines, the lancing of dissent. But as damning as this evidence was, something Harold had said kept nagging at me. Those signatures from dead people on the original formation documents. Linda, I texted as I finished the presentation, "Can you meet him at Harold's house tomorrow morning? Bring anyone else? Who remembers the HOA formation in 2000? I think our fake president might be sitting on top of an even bigger lie." Her response was immediate. "Already talked to Three Birds. Refused to sign back then. They're all wondering how the HOA got formed without them." I looked at my presentation one more time.
Ow.
Tomorrow night, Dorothy's 15-year masquerade. Wouldn't, but something told me. We hadn't yet uncovered the biggest deception of all. Type fake president, if he suspected something, was off from the beginning. I bet half of you saw this coming before Dorothy did. The next morning, our resistance group gathered in my living room like conspirators planning a revolution. Harold arrived first, followed Linda and 3 other longtime residents who'd responded to my call. Davis joined us via video call on my laptop, and surprisingly, Richard Preston showed up looking haggarded but determined. Before we go any further, Davis began as lawyer. Instincts kicking in, everyone needs to understand the full implications of what we discovered yesterday. If Dorothy was never legally elected president, then every single fine collected, every rule change made, every decision implemented in the last 15 years is null and void. The HOA potentially owes hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegally collected fines back to residents. Linda whistled low. That's life-changing money for some families. My 3-0 could pay off credit card debt. Another resident, Jim Torres, added. Grimly, my mother had to take out a loan to pay accumulated fines before she could sell her house. $8,000 for violations Dorothy made up, which is exactly why Davis continued. Dorothy will fight this with everything she has. We need ironclad proof, not just of her illegal presidency, but of the HOA's legitimacy itself. Richard, you mentioned Dorothy claimed Bob designated her a successor. Richard nodded. Pulling out his phone, I found the recording from that July 2010 meeting. Want to hear it? We gathered around as he played the fill of Dorothy's voice, younger but just as imperious, filled the room. Bob has left us, but before departing, he designated me as his successor to ensure continuity. A fluttership. We don't need lengthy elections during this difficult time. I hereby assume the presidency to protect her community standards. No one in the recording challenged her there, was scattered uncomfortable. Applause. Then the meeting moved on to other business classic shock doctrine Davis. Observe take power during a crisis when people are too stunned to resist. That's when Harold dropped his bombshell. I've been thinking about what Stan found, and some things. Been nagging at me all night. If Dorothy just declared herself president and everyone accepted it, that's bad enough. But what if the whole HOA structure she inherited was also built on lies? He pulled out a worn notebook. I've kept records of neighborhood business for 40 years. Look here, when Bob was forming the HOA in 2000, he needed 75% of homeowners to sign that state law, but I know for a fact that at least 20% of us refused. It never signed Tom Henderson, never signed Bill Martinez, never signed the Johnsons, never signed, then Wins never signed, yet somehow Bob claimed he had his 75%. The room went silent as the implications sank in through my window. I noticed Dorothy outside talking animatedly with someone in a real estate blazer. She kept gesturing at her house, then pointing down the street. Was she planning to flee? The thought sparked both satisfaction and urgency. We need to see the original formation documents, I said. The actual signature pages. Harold stood up with difficulty then. Let's go. If Bob forged signatures like I suspect, we're not just dealing with 15 years of illegal leadership, we're dealing with 25 years of a fraudulent organization within Ann Hoare. Our entire group had reconvened at the county records office. Stan had already pulled the original HOA formation documents from 2000, handling the yellowing papers like religious artifacts. These are the originals. He explained state law requires these exact documents to be preserved. They can't be altered, replaced, or destroyed. We divvied up the signature pages, each taking a section to review. Richard, trying to redeem himself, had brought his laptop with a database of property records. I'm cross-referencing every signature with property ownership records from January 2000. He explained, if someone signed who didn't own property, or if a property owner's signature is suspicious. The first discrepancy took only minutes to find. Linda held up a page, her face pale. This signature is for Margaret Thompson, dated January 15th, 2000. Harold leaned over to look, then jerked. Act like he'd been slapped. That's impossible. Margaret was Tom Henderson's wife. She died in June of '98. I spoke at her funeral. A chill ran through the room. We began checking more carefully, and the discoveries came fast and horrifying. Tom Henderson's signature dated January 2000. Died November 1998. Bill Martinez signature dated January 2000. Died December 1997. Robert Johnson's signature dated January 2000. Died August 1999. Margaret Thompson's signature dated January 2000. Died June 1998. Frank Williams' signature dated January 2000. Died March 1999. Stan pulled up death certificates on his computer, confirming each one with official records. 5 people who were already in the ground when they supposedly signed HOA formation documents. The room fell into stunned silence that lasted a full 30 seconds. Finally, Linda spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. 25 years. We've been paying dues, following rules, getting fined by an organization that never legally existed. Richard had his head in his hands. We're all accomplices to fraud. Every board member, everyone enforced these fake rules. We could all be criminals. Davis's voice cut through the growing panic. Number, you were victims, not accomplices. This is forgery, fraud, potentially racketeering under Oricio statutes Bob Mitchell created. A criminal organization, and Dorothy inherited it, whether knowingly or not. Rolled stood slowly, his age showing in every movement. All those years of being told we were troublemakers for questioning things, all those fines, all that misery based on forged signature stuff. Our dead friends. His voice cracked with emotion. Tom Henderson, it was my poker buddy for 20 years. To see his name used like this, we counted and recounted, but numbers were clear. Only 68% of homeowners had actually signed, 7% short of the legal requirement. The HOA had never been legally formed. Every relievery fine, every election, including the one that never happened for Dorothy, was built on a foundation of forgottements and dead people's signatures. So what happens now? Linda asked. Do Weckl, the police, the FBI? The state attorney Davis shook his head. First, we give the community a chance to dissolve this peacefully at tomorrow's meeting document. Everything if Dorothy or others refuse to cooperate, then we involve law enforcement, but our priority should be helping victims recover their money. Not just pursuing punishment. I looked at our group: a nurse, a retiree, a guilt-ridden board member, a government clerk with a grudge, and a burned-out software engineer. Tomorrow night, we would have tonnoed. 25 years of lies, everyone. Get some rest, I said. Tomorrow. Lakeside gets its freedom back. Shock drop a comment. I bet you didn't see the dead people's signatures. Coming by 700 p.m. The Lakeside Community Center was packed beyond capacity. All 158 households had sent representatives, creating a crowd that spilled into the hallways. The energy was electric. 25 years. Off-suppressed frustration finally had an outlet. Homemade signs dotted the crowd. 25 years of lies. Refund our fines. Truth sets us free. Dorothy sat alone in the front row, still trying to project authority in her lavender blazer, but her hands trembled as she clutched her leather folder. Even her most loyal supporters had abandoned her once. Word spread. Richard Preston sat on the opposite side of the room with other former board members, physical at a monstrant, his switch of allegiance. As I walked to the podium with my laptop, neighbors reached out to pat my shoulder or whisper encouragement. I connected my laptop to the projection system. Ready. Taz systematically demolished Dorothy's empire. The crowd noise died as I tapped the microphone. Thank you all for coming. I have 4 truths to share about our so-called HOA. By the end of tonight, you'll understand why many of you have struggled financially and why our community has lived in fear for so long. Dorothy shot to her feet immediately. This is my community. You have no authority to call meetings. I am the president of this HOA. The crowd erupted. Sit down. Dorothy, someone shouted. Let him speak, yelled another. The anger was palpable, but I raised my hand for quiet. Actually, Dorothy, your outburst is the perfect place to start. Truth number 1. I clicked to my first slide showing the property covenant. My grandparents' property has never been part of the HOA. This covenant predates the HOA by 48 years and prevents annexation. Without written consent, no consent was ever given. Every fine Dorothy gave me was legally meaningless. Dorothy's face went scarlet. It's one property. The rest of you are still bound by HOA rules, I continued calmly, which brings us to truth number. To the next slide showed empty election records. Dorothy Mitchell West, never elected president. When Bob Mitchell abandoned his position 15 years ago, no election was held. Dorothy simply announced she was in charge. Richard stood up. I confirmed this is true. Evie been on the board for 10 years. There are no election records because no election ever happened. The crowd was deafening. No, I announced truth number 3 because Dorothy was never legal represent. Every decision she made is invalid. Every fine collected over 15 years was taken illegally. Davis appeared on screen via video call. The HOA owes approximately $400,000 in illegally collected fines back to this community. Crowd exploded. Linda stood with her spreadsheet. 3,000 from my family alone. Athers began shouting their numbers. Dorothy screamed. I protected this community. I've protected this place for 15 years. Where were you when Bob left? I clicked to the final slide, truth number, for the biggest lie of all. The room went silent as I showed signatures alongside death certificates. The HOA itself was never legal. It required 75% of homeowners to sign only. 68% actualize. Egna Bob Mitchell forged signatures of dead neighbors. I read each name slowly. Tom Henderson died November 1998. Bill Martinez died December 1997. Robert Johnson died August 1999. Margaret Thompson died June 1998. Frank Williams died March 1999. All supposedly signed in January 2000. Harold stood, tears streaming down his face. Tom Henderson. Was my friend DeHurris's name used for this fraud? Dorothy collapsed into her chair. No, Bob said. He would fix the paperwork he promised. This was all. I had left Janet Palmer's studio. Your pain doesn't excuse our suffering, Dorothy. You turned your heartbreak into our nightmare. The vote was swift and overwhelming. 142 households out of 145 voted to dissolve the illegal HOA. Immediately Dorothy remained in her chair as the room emptied, mumbling, "That community, this is my community." I packed my laptop house. It but vindicated as I passed Dorothy. I paused, Dorothy. It was never your community. It belonged to all of us. She looked up with hollow eyes. What am I supposed to do now without the HOA? I'm just the woman whose husband left I had an answer for rebuilding a life after 25 years of lies. Outside neighbor. Clustered in the parking lot, sharing stories and making plans. Children played in the grass without fear of violations. The revolution was complete, but healing. Take time looking at the celebrating crowd. I realized Dorothy's empire had fallen in exactly the way she'd built it, through community action, but while she'd used fear and fines with dues. Truth and solidarity. The difference was that our foundation was real, built on actual signatures from living people. Chose freedom over control. Tomorrow Lakeside would wake up free for the first time in 25 years. No more measuring tapes, no more violation notices, no more living in fear of arbitrary rules. As I walked to my car, Linda caught up with Marcus. We owe you everything you gave us, our neighborhood back. I shook my head. We gave ourselves our neighborhood back. I just shined a light on the lies. She smiled. Well, your light started with 6 phone calls that changed everything from 911 to freedom in 6 minutes. That's gotta be some kind of record. Indeed, it was 6 minutes to destroy 25 years off deception. Sometimes the biggest empires fall not from outside attacks, but from the weight of their own lies. Dorothy had built her kingdom on forged signatures and false authority. All it took was one person willing to look closely at the foundation. The hardest part wasn't finding the truth. It was believing that the truth could actually set us free. It did. It absolutely did. But the story wasn't over yet. Stay tuned for the sweet epilogue hit. That notification bell 3 weeks later, the air in Lakeside felt lighter, as if the weight of 25 years of control had lifted. The neighborhood was transforming. Houses painted in bold colors, gardens bursting with individuality, and kids playing freely without fear of fines. The oppressive HOA was gone, and the community was rediscovering what freedom meant. I stood in my backyard, reflecting on how it alone revealed Dorothy's reign built on lies and intimidation. It crumbled in just 6 minutes. Her call to 911, meant to silence me, had instead exposed her deception to the world. I tapped a spoon against my glass, drawing the attention of neighbors gathered for Esmal celebration. You all know Dorothy's house, the one with the perfect lawn she used to judge us all by, I said, pausing as nods and chuckles rippled through the crowd when property values dropped 30%. After the HOA dissolved, turns out forced conformity doesn't protect home prices. Dorothy put it on the market. I bought it for half what she paid. Gasps and applause erupted. But I'm not keeping it. It's becoming a community garden. Free vegetables, no rules, no approved species list. The house will be a true community center for kids' homework help and senior socials. No HOA meetings ever. The crowd cheered, and Harold raised his beer to Marcus the accidental HOA slayer. Over 100 voices joined in toasting to freedom and a reborn Lakeside. Dorothy, meanwhile, had fled 3 states away to a 55-plus community in Arizona, and with no HOA. Ironically, maybe she'd learn it that real community thrives on respect, not control, or maybe she couldn't foresee neighbors she'd tormented for decades. Either way, she was gone. Her legacy of fear replaced by hope, looking at the lake stars reflecting on its surface. I raised my glass to my grandparents. Your home is safe now, I whispered, and it's truly free. The sound of laughter and chatter filled the air. No permits, no fines, just people living freely. Like and subscribe if you believe every neighborhood deserves freedom from tyrannical HOAs. Always read fine print. Sometimes the biggest lies are hiding in plain sight. Peace out.